Let's imagine this. You put something out there. It could be a text, it could be a post, it could be anything. And then you wait. You hope for the likes to go up. You hope to get a good feedback. Sometimes you do, sometimes you don't. And somewhere in that gap, something in your chest tightens, like a needle swinging away from safe. That needle has a name in psychology. And today, we're coming back to it more than once. This is Thinking Forward, and my name is Hooria Hashmi, and today we'll be talking about validation seeking, why it's a trap none of us see closing, and what research has to say about breaking free of it. First, the part that might surprise you, that gauge isn't a flaw. It's not you being too insensitive, too insecure, or too shallow. There's a psychologist named McClary who built an entire theory around it, which he called the social meter theory, a concept on self-esteem, which he explains self-esteem as something not being a measure of how good you are, but now being a measure of whether the people around you are accepting you or are quietly pulling away. If you go back far in human history, you realize that gauge made complete sense, that losing your place in society wasn't just inconvenience, it was a matter of surviving the winter or not. So evolution has built an early warning system in us that's to spike with anxiety at the slightest hint of disapproval and settle once we are back in control. There's research from Jennifer Crocker and Connie Wolf on contingent self-worth, where they describe self-worth as being something where each of us have decided what our self-esteem rests on. For most of us, it's our work. For some of us, it's our appearance. And for most people, it's whether the people around us are accepting us or are quietly pulling away. But then when approval becomes a thing that your worth rests on, your sense of I'm okay stops living inside you and it moves outside. It becomes something that you keep going out and collecting from people who never even signed up to do that job. Crocker further researches this into telling us that this affects how people manage their lives. It affects their relationships, it affects their physical health, it affects their sense of independence. Because at the end of the day, you're actually not making decisions anymore. You're managing an audience. And it gets stranger. There's a related theory called the self-verification theory that states that we don't just chase feedback that feels good, we chase feedback that feels familiar. So if it's a part of you that believes that you're not good enough, you're not just going to accept feedback that says so. You go out looking for it. Not because it feels good, but because it feels familiar. This isn't random. A lot of it traces back to whether growing up, love and approval felt steady, or it was something that you had to keep going out and re-earning. Good grades, good performance, be easy, don't be too much. Whether acceptance depended on performance as a kid. The lesson that gets installed here is simple. That love has to be re-earned time and time again, with no exceptions. And all of this doesn't just go away once you grow up. It shows up later in how many times you reread a text before sending it, in how uncomfortable you are in a room with strangers. There's actually a clinical name for it, for the extreme version of it. Schema therapists call it the approval-seeking schema. And the way you tell it apart from the normal reassurance seeking isn't really about the big moments of doubt. It's about the constancy of it. It's about needing it many times a day, just enough to function. Remember that drop in your chest at the start of the episode? Here's what's actually happening. Researchers have found that social media runs on something called the variable ratio reinforcement, the same system that's installed in slot machines. You never really know when the reward is coming, so the anticipation alone keeps you checking. Brain imaging studies have found that getting good feedback triggers the part of your brain that's moved by food and pleasure, and getting negative feedback triggers the same centers associated with physical pain. So these systems didn't really invent your need for approval. They just found the oldest button in the human brain and engineered the most efficient way to keep pressing it. Here are a few things grounded in actual research that are worth trying. 1, stop outsourcing your verdict. External validation involves submitting yourself for judgment even before you've made an opinion of your own. The intervention here isn't to stop caring about what people think, but to have an opinion of yourself first. So before you post, before you send a text, or before you ask if what you're doing is okay, just stop for a moment and ask yourself, am I okay with what I'm doing? and let that be enough for you. Researchers call this the internal locus of evaluation, and it has been one of the consistent predictors of well-being across many cultures. The goal here isn't to stop caring about what people think, but it's to make sure that their verdict doesn't replace yours. Think of your opinion as the first draft of your identity. Every time you ask yourself what you really think about something, before asking anyone else, you reinforce the idea that your thoughts have value. Your thoughts don't necessarily have to be correct. You're just giving yourself the respect of hearing your own voice first before allowing anyone else into the conversation. Seeking advice is healthy when it helps you refine your thinking, but it becomes harmful when it replaces your thinking. There's a difference between asking, "What do you think of this?" after you've had an opinion of yourself first, than asking others because you can't form an opinion of yourself. 2. Sit in the discomfort without actually fixing it. The core engine of validation seeking is the intolerance of uncertainty, specifically the uncertainty of not knowing how you're being perceived by others. Cognitive behavioral research shows that what actually lowers the intolerance is practicing not resolving it, not fixing it, not going fishing, not rereading to calibrate. You're teaching your nervous system what it actually needs to learn, that the discomfort is only temporary and you don't need external validation to stay standing. The urge to remove uncertainty often feels overwhelming because your brain interprets it as danger. But what's actually happening is that the uncertainty is a lack of information. So the more you allow yourself to sit with that discomfort without actually fixing it, without reacting, the more you're teaching your brain that that uncertainty is survivable. When you resist the impulse to seek reassurance, you may initially feel uncomfortable because growth is uncomfortable. Breaking a habit is uncomfortable. Learning a habit is uncomfortable. So instead of seeing this as something, as a means that you must give in, you must rather see it as evidence that your brain is learning a new pattern. So instead of immediately checking your phone, asking someone, "What do you think? Am I doing okay? Am I doing enough?" Just pause for a second and ask yourself, what story am I creating in my mind? Often, you realize that you are treating assumptions as fact. Remember that feelings are temporary. Anxiety rises, it reaches a peak, and then it subsides. Sometimes, even when you do nothing about it. Eventually, when you allow these things to happen naturally, you are training your brain to strengthen the emotional resilience. Every time you allow that process to happen naturally, you are increasing your emotional resilience and you're lowering your dependence on external validation. Ask yourself whose approval you're actually seeking. Sometimes, the person whose reaction you're waiting for isn't even in the room. It could be a parent, it could be a friend, it could be someone from 8 years ago whose opinion you absorbed so deeply that it became your own voice. Psychologist Susan Hatter found that people who grew up in environments where approval was conditional often grow up with an internalized judge that no amount of external validation can satisfy. The goal here isn't to get more likes. It's to figure out whose voice you're actually trying to satisfy, and then slowly try to separate your voice from theirs. Many of us spend years chasing approval without even knowing whose expectations we are trying to meet. Sometimes these standards, these values are not even ours. Sometimes we could be carrying expectations of people that helped us in our childhood or were there in significant moments in our lives. What we don't realize is that over time, we tend to take their opinions as our own voice and forget that we can even grow up to separate our voice from theirs. Take a moment before you question your inner critic, before asking questions like, "Am I doing enough?" or saying things like, "I'm disappointed in myself, I could have done better." Just stop and ask yourself, whose values am I holding? Whose voice am I hearing? Because sometimes that voice isn't yours. Because sometimes you're doing just enough to survive through that day. It is also important to understand that seeking approval started as a survival strategy. Children depend on parents and need their approval when growing up. In childhood, this makes complete sense because it solidifies the relationship that you have with your parents, which is completely normal. But then once you grow up and you carry these things into adulthood, you realize that it's taking away your sense of independence, your sense of self-worth. And then you grow up being a product of their own decisions, of someone else's expectations, without even realizing that you have a voice of your own. As you realize the people whose approval means everything to you, try and be gentle with yourself. Try and understand that these opinions are not permanent definitions of your character. That is not who you are. That's a version of you. And as humans, as time goes on, we are allowed to change. We are allowed to refine that version of ourselves. We have the freedom to choose. We have the freedom to do what pleases us. And that should be enough for us. Replace self-esteem with self-compassion. Researchers have been studying this for over 20 years, and their findings are almost counterintuitive. Self-compassion produces a more stable, a less defensive, a less outcome-dependent sense of worth than self-esteem does. The difference here is structural. Self-esteem is comparative. It requires you to be okay relative to someone else or something else. Self-compassion is unconditional. It requires you to be okay, to take care of yourself just as you would do for someone else. The next thing is build a private record of your own judgment. This is one of the successful predictors of well-being. Keep somewhere private a log of decisions that you made out of your own instincts. What this actually does is it creates an evidence base, something people that suffer with external validation do not have. People that suffer with external validation do not have internal data to draw on, because all they've done their whole life is outsource that verdict, that validation from people externally. What you do here is that you create a log of decisions, small things, what you chose, what you thought of when someone said something, the call you made without confirming it, things that you did for your own self, from your own instincts. What it's actually doing here is that it's building that confidence, it's building that self-trust, not just out of the blue, but slowly. You're building an evidence base, something that you can always come back to. And all of this isn't just like a switch that you turn off and on. What you do is you try to teach yourself that your opinion, that your thoughts actually are valuable. But you can only do that when the internal data that you're drawing, you use it. Social comparison theory laid out something that we all do automatically, even without realizing it. We measure up our life against version of other people who have a curated version of it, people who have edited their life over and over, a version of their life that you saw even before editing. Someone's trip, someone's body, someone's dream job. They don't really show how they struggle to get that. They show you a version of it that's only fantasizing. It creates fantasies in you. And at the end of the day, you forget that you have a life to live of your own. What you can actually do here is that tell yourself, that's a comparison. That's not who I am. What you're actually doing here is that you're taking control of the situation, because that comparison is automatic. But knowing that how to handle that, the reaction, the response, all of that is in your control, and that is not automatic. That's something that you can take control of. That's something that you can decide how to do, when to do. Recognize your attachment wiring in real relationships. This one specifically about people close to you, no strangers online. Researchers have mapped out attachment styles. Today we'll be talking about the anxious attachment styles, because these are the people that seek the external validation, needing frequent reassurance from a friend or a partner, rereading texts many times before feeling comfortable. If that feels familiar, this is not about shaming you out of needing closeness. Humans need closeness, but it's to understand that there's a difference between the actual threat and the alarm that it's creating. Most of the time, we get caught up between the two. What you can do here is name the pattern out loud, or you could do it with a friend. Just be open about it. Express how you're feeling, and mostly This has been one of the consistent ways and most reliable ways of loosening the grip. Put an actual boundary between you and the machine. Researchers call this FOMO, the fear of missing out. The anxious urge to check isn't really about missing information. It's about not being in the loop. So the fix here isn't willpower, it's friction. Turn off read receipts on your phone if you can. Turn off notification badges on your phone. Put the phone in a different room if you have to do something that's really important to you. What you're doing here is that you're making sure you're not on call for your nervous system 24 hours a day. Findings suggest that even these small structural changes, not big moral ones, help reduce the compulsion. What you're doing here is that you are blocking the machine's ability to interrupt rather than trying to out-discipline it. Act on your values whether anyone notices or not. There's a hard line between how you feel and what you do. And we can argue that a steady life gets built on the second one, not the first. So pick one value that matters more to you: creativity, honesty, or just being truthful. And act on it. Take small decisions that align with that value. Not to get applause from anyone, not to get recognition from anyone. Just do it for yourself. And over time, you realize that you're building, as I said from the beginning of the episode, an evidence base, something that you can always rely on, something to always fall back on. Because the problem here, what you're trying to resolve here, isn't to stop listening to others, isn't to not care about what people think, isn't to live a personality, a behavior, portray an attitude that's totally different from who you are. But it's to make sure that at the end of the day, whether someone applauds you or not, whether someone gives you the validation or not, you can still function. You can make sure that you can function steadily. Remember that needle from the start of the episode. It's not a sign of weakness. It's a nervous system that has learned over time that belonging was something it constantly had to monitor. And that's not your fault. It's an adaptation to the environment you were in. One thing you can notice here is that learned patterns can be unlearned. So the next time you feel the need to pull and check, to seek reassurance, to validate your feelings, not internally, but externally, pause for a second and ask yourself, what do I actually think of this? And let that be enough, just for today. Because here's the thing about self-trust. It doesn't just build, it accumulates over small decisions that you took, that log of decisions that you took, that private record that you kept, that evidence base that you created. That helps you stay intact. That helps you stay steady. If this episode gave you something to sit with, share it with a friend. Leave a comment if you can. This has been Thinking Forward. Thank you for sitting with me through the episode. Until the next one. Bye.